rápido, a la segunda sesión de este seminario, de esta conferencia sobre Libertad, Arte y Cultura. Tengo el placer de tener a mi derecha a Roger de Deu, responsable de la Fundación Gabeiras, que es quien ha organizado todo esto y con quien hemos tenido el placer de colaborar al mismo tiempo que con el Círculo de Bellas Artes y con el Museo Thyssen-Bornemisza, y a todos les damos las gracias. Creo que es un seminario importante, es un seminario necesario, es un seminario urgente, y lo es por muchas razones. En primer lugar, y supongo que se habrá mencionado y se mencionará porque estamos en un momento de crisis, que viene ya después de la crisis se suma la crisis del 2008-2009, una crisis que, a diferencia de aquella que de algún modo formaba parte de estos movimientos del capitalismo que tanto sabe trabajar a partir de crisis para, digamos, seguir en sus esfuerzos de conseguir, para lo que está hecho, más recursos, más beneficios. Con la crisis, catástrofe del COVID y con lo que se ve en estos años, se ve que de algún modo capitalismo y democracia son cada vez más incompatibles. Y ahí es donde una reflexión sobre censura, un debate sobre los mecanismos que el sistema en el cual vivimos tiene establecidos para que no haya libertad de creación, para que la libertad de opinión sea cada vez más reducida, lo que quiere decir libertad de vida, lo que quiere decir democracia, etcétera, etcétera, creo que es necesario. El hecho de que sea un debate, de que se apunten a unos elementos y a otros, creo que es algo esencial, porque, como decía Adam Curtis, parece que no hay nadie, que es difícil desvelar quién está al mando, porque da la impresión de que no hay nadie al mando. Quien está al mando es esta especie de deep state que está, digamos, que se esconde, que es difícil de sacar a la luz. Y, por tanto, como digo, una reflexión sobre la censura es importante, una reflexión que, sin excluir, por supuesto, los elementos más brutales de una exposición, una obra de teatro, una película que se censura, ni, como ocurrió con los años 30, todo un tipo de arte que se denomina arte degenerado, también anote, también vea aquello que está escondido, aquello que forma parte casi de nuestros hábitos, de nuestro lenguaje, de lo que percibimos como si fuera algo natural y que es difícil de identificar. Me estoy refiriendo a una censura estructural, a una censura que hace que las instituciones, los museos, inviten artistas y luego, digamos, haya una especie de violencia respecto, como denunció en algún momento Ute Meta, respecto a estos artistas. Y esto no quiere decir que la gente de dentro, digamos, los que estamos dentro, estemos en contra de lo que estamos fuera. Hay una resistencia por la parte que está también dentro, que sufre esta misma violencia. Por tanto, estamos con dos violencias, hacia afuera y hacia adentro. La violencia o digamos, los elementos que coarcen nuestra libertad, como decía, en el lenguaje, en los procedimientos administrativos, en qué nos imaginamos en qué consiste, digamos, nuestras prácticas, en un tipo de prácticas competitivas, en un tipo de prácticas individualizadas, en un tipo de prácticas donde parece que todos estamos en una carrera por saber qué tiene más éxito, quién tiene más visitantes. Ya estamos cayendo nosotros mismos en una trampa. Por tanto, es obviamente necesario decolonizar en este sentido, el sentido que colonialismo, capitalismo, violencia, censura, como ha dicho en repetidas ocasiones Rita Segato, van de la mano. Es importante diferenciarlo, y de algún modo esta primera sesión con Germán Labrador con Joanna Mytkowska y con Ute Meta Bauer, queríamos que reflexionase sobre estos temas. De ahí que habréis visto que creo que todas las instituciones, las 3 instituciones organizadoras o la idea era que tuviesen un caso de estudio de un elemento de censura, y nosotros estuvimos dudando sobre qué escoger, si escoger algunas de las denuncias que a veces ha habido con el museo, y al final decidimos no hacer ningún vídeo, porque de algún modo la violencia o la censura que hoy vamos a debatir es esa censura que no se ve, esa censura que es muy difícil de representar, porque seguramente tenemos que inventar nuestras formas de representación. Y ya con esto, hablando de autocensura, de autocolonización, vamos a pasar a una lengua hegemónica, vamos a pasar al inglés, porque los otros 2 representantes, aparte de Germán, no hablan castellano, y entonces vamos a ver un inglés con acento catalán, acento gallego, acento polaco y acento alemán, pero creo que nos vamos a divertir. So, I change. Ute, Joanna, Germán, ¿estáis por ahí? Are you there? Hello? Sound is working? Now? Maybe it's because we are not speaking. Now? Okay. So, good morning, good evening, Ute. And thank you for accepting to be here. Of course, since we were talking before in this brief introduction about dealing with the censorship that we don't see, the censorship that somehow is in our own bodies, the censorship which is structural, that we don't even realize, and that censorship has many levels. Has a censorship of language, of course. It's also a censorship of structures, of procedures, of a space that we imagine is free, but of course is not. And is censorship of our own desires or our own ideas about what education, what a museum should be. You are in 3 different contexts. Germán is a professor, Joanna is director of a museum, and Ute is everything. Is professor, has been directing a museum. Ute has been in very different contexts. So I think it will be good maybe that you can also speak from your own experience, because I think it's very important to break with this element of abstraction, this general element that somehow brings us outside of what we call un enunciado situado, what we call knowledge which is situated in one place. So yesterday, very late, and I apologize, I sent you an email. I don't know if you received it, and if not, no, you no, okay. And I was proposing 3 authors, 3 names to start the discussion. The 3 authors, one was Klemperer, that wrote this well-known book, The Third Language of the Rights, the language of the third Reich, sorry, and where he wrote it, or he published it in 47, 46, 47, and so that means that he published it right after Second World War, but he wrote it during Nazism, and somehow what he was showing is how, besides the fact that the Nazi regime had expired, or Hitler was not there, Nazi Germany was defeated, the language of the Third Reich was still there. And I think this is quite important to understand and to decolonize our own language. So that was one reference I wanted to point, and I know Germán has been working a lot on that. The second reference is a text by Hans Hacke that he published, it was a lecture actually, that he published in 1884, and it was called Museums, Managers of Consciousness. And in a way, in that text, he was already pointing to the fact that many museums, especially in the States, in New York, is the moment of Guggenheim big thing about franchises, is the moment of metropolitan blockbuster shows that, let's say, quote, quote, traditional artistic direction, intellectual direction of museums were being substituted by managers, by people for whom, by structures for whom what it was important is numbers, is money, he denounced that we were entering into a process where we were making more money to build more spaces, more buildings. That was, of course, linked to real estate. That was, of course, linked to financial capital. And then we needed to raise more money to keep on building more buildings that were not ecological, that were, et cetera, all those things that we know. And the third text, it was also a lecture by Derrida that he did in '96 in Strasbourg, and it became later on a book on hospitality, and he points to a contradiction about the universal law of the need to, or the right to receive a guest, a foreigner, and to receive it as a foreigner. You receive a stranger as a stranger. And however, he was contrasting that with national laws where the stranger to be accepted cannot be a stranger anymore, has to learn the language, has to accept the laws, has to probably dress differently. So then, in a way, this universal right is disappearing. And maybe, and that's the point, and then I will leave the table to you, museums that were places in this enlightened idea of universal, quote, quote, universal knowledge have become places on the contrary, where this kind of, where you don't welcome anymore the stranger, but where you force the stranger to become like yours. And you do that through many categories. I mean, one case, and with that I will finish, which is very clear, is whenever we are discussing Latin American so-called conceptual art, that, you know, a big part of Latin American conceptual art, it was done from 60s, of course, but also 70s, 80s. That means in the moment of neoliberalism. Not only that, it means in the moment where Latin America, i.e. Chile, became a place of experiment for neoliberalism. However, when you started looking at American universities, exhibitions, etc., it looked like this type of practices that in a way they were a reaction against neoliberalism, and therefore they were more situated place in aesthetics, in a poetics, in a practice of the 80s, because formally it looked like the 60s, they were thought like conceptual practice of the 60s, and they were thought that they were just late in relation to, you know, what it was done in the North. So this type of censorship pressure is one that we do, unfortunately, every day. And with that, I wanted to pass the table into you. First, as I said, with Germán, that has dealt with those issues. Then I thought that maybe we should do it geographically. Joanna is a little bit farther away from us, and you are in a museum of modern art. You've been representing Poland in Venice Biennial. You are in a country that maybe is difficult or maybe not, that you have to say how to deal in an institution, in a national institution, in a context like ours. And Ute, that you've been in all the places, and also you combine museum with education, with production. We forget also that a museum is not just a temple or not just a house, it's an ecosystem. And we forgot, very often we only think ourselves, and we have to think about an ecosystem, the importance of how to produce, how to create that this ecosystem, that means artists, producers, mediators, educators, is alive, is very important. So those are my questions, my readings, and I pass the word to Germán.
Invitation for all the people who involved in organizing this colloquium, also for the colleagues in this panel. Also, I don't know if there is much people there presently, because it's very strange, both virtually and physically, but I guess there should be an audience there. And I have to say, thank you for coming here at this early hour. Before starting my short presentation, I'm going to mention that it's very interesting the reflection on institutions and the transformation of institutions in neoliberalism that was mentioned in Manolo in relation to our institutions, but it's also the same with first line research universities. In past years, the numbers of professional tenure line researchers, so like structural researchers, is almost the same for several decades, but not the number of buildings on my campus, for instance. Or if you go to New York, two major players in the market sector of real estate are two big research universities, as Columbia and NYU. That tells a lot about the place of also research institutions in that globalized world that is collapsing. Okay, so some minutes ago, before the colloquium, I got that email by Manolo asking to make some shortcuts in the presentation, so I'm going to try to adjust this 15 minutes presentation to a 10 minutes one. I'm not sure if I'm going to make it. So I'm going to go briefly. What I'm presenting are some notes on the general topic of the conference, but in relation to the language ideologies of the so-called populist right. So I will present some of the ideas by Victor Kempfer in fascism as a culture of ideology, as an ideology of culture, reflecting on their particular application today in the current situation. So we see today fascism as a far-off historical figuration, as the other monstrous of our democratic present. But however, in this emergence in the 30s, it was perceived not as a new language, but rather as a new intensity of already new words. Like it was everyday language just transformed in a very particular intensity. Fascism was not something promising gas chambers, torture, and genocide, but just a different use of an already existing nationalistic language, which spoke of freedom, unity, economy, and family. And that was maybe the reason why it was so natural for many as at the beginning. So it would be possible to define fascism as a particular state of the language, a radical activation of the lexicon of the national state and of the morality which is integrated into everyday life. In the fastest evolution of a national language, the known words are dissociated from the universe of practices and values to which they previously referred to, and to the symbolic economy of language that it was at its base. So a very key again, mark of that fasted activation of nationalist language means refers to the disconnection to reality and the creation of autonomous public spheres. So I think that's a key procedure for this evolution. What fascism achieves is the industrial production of a dissociated language. Thanks to this industrial dimension, we call this propaganda. In the fascist universe, propaganda proposed a new articulation between word and will through repetition. Language does not lie. That's a common expression to refer to Kempler's thoughts. No regime, whether fascist or not, denounces the pain and harm that is at its basis, but no language neither is able to fully make visible violence that is serving to in front of the very world that it handles. We need a language apparatus to ideologically organize the horror ruled by politics. Kempler argues that fascism, as facts, was visible in front of everybody, but
only inside of language. And I quote, fascism transformed language in its more powerful propaganda, public and secret at the time. Ideology, in every epoch, is inscribed on language and aesthetics, making visible but not transparent what is necessary to make understandable but not explicit. So that's I think a key point about ideology. So it's something that is happening there that we, if we just analyze from a close perspective, it's pretty obvious, but in its way of acting is just in, almost invisible. So something that is opaque in between transparency and invisibility. New populist right represents something new only in a particular way. Of course, we are not in the 30s, so parallelism are always very limited. Differences are not about the rule of law and civil rights, or not only, but about technologies of power. Capitalism manages in different ways bodies, time, and wills in this past century. One of the major events in past years is, of course, the reformulation of classical liberal public spheres by the digital revolution. And now we're talking about censorship in relation to transformation of public spheres, technological transformation of public spheres. The process started in the late 90s, but increased in recent years. Classic public spheres have been shaken globally by the structural mutation of internet, whose consequences we still do not understand fully. Free speech today can be only articulated in relation to the existence of a virtual culture, but the transformation of virtual cultures since 2011 is rendering that public sphere impossible. So in the past decade, we moved from a more open, democratic virtual sphere to an encapsulated, more like new enclosure. They're calling it encapsulated, fragmentarian, virtual public sphere. To explain so, I would like to evoke a recent Spanish novel, La habitación oscura by Isaac Rosa, The Dark Room, and more precisely, its literary device, A Chambre Noire. The Camera Oscura is here a powerful metaphor to explore censorship, free speech, the crisis of democracy, literature, and the public sphere in today's Spain. In this novel, Rosa proposes a disturbing space, a dark room, that is a chronotype with a long literary history from Plato to Allan Poe. But Rosa updates this tradition in a present context marked by precariousness and the economic crisis. In the novel, we have a group of friends that decides to build up a dark room for social and erotic activity. That was at least the initial intention, as they will get later involved in political activity. The reader progressively understands that this dark room is a metaphor for the internet. For Rosa, the digital represents the possibility of a new type of public space where everything can be said and can be seen with no censorship, thanks to a false sensation of being protected by darkness, by anonymity. However, unexpectedly, at the end of Rosa's story, the dark room will expose the group to political repression. But by this way, Rosa describes the paradoxical condition of a digital public space in contemporary era as a place for freedom of expression and as a place for total vigilance, total surveillance. Freedom and control are here circumstances not exclusive but complementary. The globally connected dark room called internet would be a kind of inverse panopticon, one that Michel Foucault may have liked. In the digital panopticon, everyone acts as if there is no one watching, but at the same time, we all know that all our communications are fully transparent to state agencies and corporations. All that was once private becomes now public inside such a room. And at the same time, economics interests privatize all that was once public. Rosa's piece is also a reflection on the novel itself as a space of resistance, as another dark chamber where democracy may still be reimagined. Freedom of expression is then linked to the autonomy of fiction. In the classical public sphere, free speech had to do with the ability to say everything, but digitalization insists at the same time in the collective construction of horizontal voices. Digital freedom of expression was formulated in the following way: the freedom of anyone to say anything in the same conditions that any other. Internet used to represent here a radical hierarchization of bourgeois culture. Ancient newspapers and blogs recently created were placed at the same level. So like all media and new media were at the same level. So amateur thinkers and recognized intellectuals were also at the same level at the beginning of that transformation. On the one hand, these mutations suppose a striking empowerment of civil society through collective recreation, from Wikipedia to YouTube channels. But on the other side, new forms of authority are being produced based on big data. We don't know anything about the future of internet, but we do know that fake news, algorithms, and mass ecology are part of present. What is censorship and free speech within this context? I may quote the Portuguese novelist Gonçalo Tavares with interesting thoughts on the question. Tavares insists on the importance of temporal acceleration and information access. He believes that censorship in Europe today is not about hiding anything, but about speed. Important news are quickly displaced by more and more news. And he says, speed is today a way of unconscious censorship. New populist language mobilized a limited repertoire of tropes and symbols supported by new technologically implemented communication techniques, post-truth, fake news, and beyond the active participation of social bases. A key critic for our context in past years, Guillem Martinez, identified the communicative practices of the turn of the century in the Spanish right first, and then in the Generalitat Progressisme, with the new languages of the new right-wing populism since 2016. It would be like a systemic reaction to the global crisis of neoliberalism, a kind of cultural counter-revolution against the citizen mobilizations of the source cycle 11-15. Our own populist party, Vox, appear at this context as a gesture of language closure, a national identity closure around the structure of the national states. 4 short additional points. Since 2011, many transformations have taken place in the digital sphere. New media do not support any more autonomous, unregulated, and critical communication, or at least primarily. Digital universe turns into closed communities framing. We move from anonymous chats and blogs to one single man pages on platforms. Many agoras disappear in the process. Discussion only happens among a group of people that thinks and feel mostly the same, and that's something technologically designed. Second point, trolls have to do, like internet trolls, have to do a lot with this process. Like the Nazi militants in the workers' bars of the Weimar Republic, the far-right trolls seek not much to convince their adversaries, but to prevent the autonomous functioning of a public sphere. And that's crucial. Censorship is not always to prevent saying something in particular, but to avoid the possibility of a discussion. Censorship is and always have been more about avoiding the normal use of a public sphere than about avoiding the circulation of a specific information. The Assange case is a must at this regard. All the information published by Assange we already knew, but the thing is not about the particular information, but about the fact of citizens being able to disclosure that information. Third point, new populist languages procedures are always the same, and they talk about the existence of a transnational articulation of this language campaign, a new fascist nature. Like in Philippines, Brazil, US, or Spain, same similar communication strategies are being used at this moment. And they are structured along 5 main lines. First, anti-feminism. Second, nationalism. Third, anti-communism. 4, anti-immigration. And finally, the China doctrine. There is no alternative. So just against those who want to offer the different geopolitical or ecological frameworks. New populist language is based on the transformation of everyday language, as I already mentioned, and particularly anti-fascism as a language. And that's the final point about this analysis. So the change in the concept of fascism is one of the central discursive strategies of the right-wing populism. I did some analysis with a colleague of the uses of fascism in official social networks during this past year. It's only one word, fascism, forming part of a more extended semantic field that includes totalitarian, dictatorship, or liberticide. These words do not refer in any case to the suppression of civil rights, police persecution, or political opponents. The new uses of fascism relate to progressive dictatorship, what is called progressive dictatorship. So it's a way to refer all the moral language of the left regarding feminism, racism, or environmentalism. All of that is now fascism. In this way, for instance, if someone makes a xenophobic comments and another person catches their attention, under this discursive framework, the Nazi or the fascist would be the second person, the person that says, hey, this is racism. So censorship along the same line is no longer something that the state exercises through content control, kidnapping, or closing media, or through the imprisonment or the contrary to government. Censorship now, within this far-right language, is the act of arguing with someone that you think differently. Censorship is no longer someone who faces arrest, but simply someone whose opinion or language is peacefully questioned by other civilians. And just to conclude, this is a particular poetic comment with Manolo's reflection. Can I see the last? ¿Puedo ver la última imagen del PowerPoint? O sea, tenía un PowerPoint, pero he tenido que cortarlo por culpa o gracias a estas. Ahí está. Okay. Following Manolo's ideas on culture institutions are as care institutions, I will conclude with an image of photographer Fernando Sanchez, who proposes a melancholic reflection on the place of art after 2011 cycle of political protests. The photo was taken in one of the entrances of the... Tengo un poco de eco en el sonido. No me... ¿Sí? Okay. The photo was taken in one of the entrances to the Reina Sofia Museum, an institution committed to the transformation of civil society during that cycle. The photo was taken on a winter night in 2015. The light of the luminous time allowed the photographer to take the picture with the relief of the museum trying to make itself visible on the night of the crisis. We see 3 homeless people, victims of the crisis, maybe evicted or maybe migrants. We don't know. They sleep protected by the light of the sign. This seems to defend them from the darkness. The night threatens to dissolve them forever in the mortal invisibility of the crisis, but there is something else which is not easy to observe simple vista. It's winter, and it's cold, and in addition to light, the Reina Sofia poster gives heat. It's like a kind of a stove, una estufa, in the public sphere. That heat is the productive materiality of a form. These 3 people remain alive using the surplus energy that the artistic institution gives off. However, they are not able to take refuge in the interior of their institution. There is a wall of separation. The eye of the photojournalist, also in the border between art and the street, also teaches us that limit in the political circulation of images. We need to build up that kind of a gaze, one gaze that gives not only light, but also warmth. And I pass the table to Joanna, I think.
Thank you. Thank you, Germán. Thank you. Oh. Is the sound okay now? No. Yeah, it's okay. Can you hear me? Okay. So thank you very much, Germán. Thank you, Manolo. It's a great pleasure to be invited and have this possibility to share with you some reflection, or rather experiences from the last couple of years of living under populist governments. So I'm going to give you a very short report how the institutional life can look like under this condition. Of course, populism in Poland has a local character, but I guess we are this populism is also sharing a lot of feature with the populism in other parts of the globe. I can only, of course, mention very few symptoms, and then I would like to share with you dilemmas we are having in the institution, how to operate, how to function, how to survive that situation. So first of all, what is probably the most striking is that the logic of the cultural war become sort of a official policy in Poland. So we are living in the official cultural war when the governmental public media are supporting one part of that conflict. So it's not only propaganda, it's not only symbolic, but also it's followed by distribution of financial support, grants, jobs, and position. So this is sort of in very general terms the landscape. Then it's followed by the dismantling of a legal system. So step by step, we are losing sense of what are the rules of law. The decision process is not transparent, and the decisions are made in an obscure way. So it's no negotiation, no discussion of the positions, but it's just sort of adjusting to the shrinking sphere of the clear legal regulations. And the third feature, which is influencing the most our way of operating right now, it's this ideological agenda of the government, which I would say is not really clear, and is more, of course, a political marketing. So the main feature is a constant mobilizing of their own supporters. So the constant radicalization of the position. And also it's sort of a flux, so we never know what we can expect. But the logic, it's always based on the creation of the enemy. Some of them are known, globally known, like immigrants, LGBT communities, feminists. Some are local, like in our case, sometimes there are some historical references. I'm quite embarrassed to mention that some nations become enemy, like Germans. I'm very sorry, or elites. So as you see, this is like living a bit in a bad dream. And then on the top of that is the way, and Germán beautifully described that, the way how the language is manipulated. So probably the most painful is that extremely difficult to articulate in the public debate your own position, because you are always stuck in the logic of the cultural war. So whatever you say is always referring to that imposed fictional conflict. And then the language of propaganda of the governmental public media are such a mixture of a cliche and stereotypes, but also they are having an element of a real agenda, especially economical, social. So it's very difficult to dismantle this and articulate your own position. So this is very painful experience. Our main tool, which is the language, which is articulation of the ideas, it's not effective in the public debate. Of course, you can still debate in your own circle, in your own so-called bubble, but you cannot pass this debate into the public debate, at least the public debate which will somehow influential in the larger scale. So that this is a few symptoms I wanted to mention, but this is of course provoking dilemmas we are having, and this obviously completely changed the way how the institutions are operating. Just to be fair, I just have to make a small footnote that populism in a political system, in a social life, is of course overwhelming, influencing a lot the way how we are living at the moment. But it's not everything. It's not all. It's not covering all aspects of life. And in Poland, we have a very strong local governments on the level of the cities, towns, small towns or villages, and those just to mention that as an example, those are still areas where legal system rules, debates are functioning. So this is not like a black and white picture. It's of course more complex, and this is also giving us the space to play more complex games with the current politics. For instance, also that's a good example that only 50% of the financial support for culture is through national government. So there are still, of course, areas, and also that's probably I can speak with you today. But what I wanted to say, I wanted to give you three examples. The first is to say, and that was mentioned also before, about censorship. Obviously, we don't have a censorship in a sense of 20th century censorship, so it's impossible in the area of social media, private media, and the complexity of social life. But what we experience in this condition is self-censorship. We perfectly know, we can say how much we can do, or we can guess, let's say, where this border, when we cross this border, we can risk financing, or we can risk even existence of the institution. And this is not only about the institutions, it's also about artists, individual artists or cultural workers. They are different scale, different situation, but the mechanism is, I would say, universal, that what we experience is self-censorship. What we can survive as a institution or individual, what we can risk. To give you example, for instance, 2 years ago we were hosting a parliament of bodies, the project run by Paul Preciado, and it was planned. The session was planned on the day of Polish Independence Day. And this day is traditionally the day when the neo-fascists are demonstrating on the streets of Warsaw, and usually it's provoking a huge hooligans riots. It's dangerous on the street, and we didn't censor the project, but for instance, we decided not to, as an institution, but we supported the project. We were part of this, but we decided not to announce it in the public media, because we had the fear of, because we are obviously invigilated by the organizations which don't like it. Afraid that in that specific day we might experience a physical attack in the institutions. But that was obviously the act of a censorship, and that was not announced like all other our programs in the public media. The other, this sort of decision, to give you a picture how it's functioned, last year during the show dedicated to the history of the anti-fascist movement, we were showing the poster campaign by Wolfgang Tillmans that was a specific campaign against dismantling European Union, and the names of politicians were mentioned. So we asked the artists that for this presentation, we will not use the poster with the Polish politicians, which would be obviously very relevant, because we thought that this is exactly this border when we will have the names of Polish politicians in the exhibition, we will not manage to handle attacks from the public media. So those are the situations we experience, for instance, and when we acted self-censorship. The second dilemma, it's about how to escape the logic of the cultural war. This is something we are debating all the time. Obviously, we are mostly talking, we are mostly collaborating, we are mostly with our public, and we share the ideas. But this is not the role of the public institution. So the question is how to act beyond this invented by populist division. We don't have great answers. The answers are sometimes sort of paradoxical, and we were trying many different strategies, and unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, the only which were sort of effective, there were moments when we were referring to the very classical artifacts, and for instance, the history of anti-fascist movement with the classical references to Guernica. That was something which was sort of working. Or we organized an exhibition of an Albanian artist, Edi Hila, who was in his painting telling the very painful story of Albanian transformation, the trauma of a sort of anxiety in the changing political systems, and that was something which was beyond those division into progressive and conservative in Polish society, understandable. And what was especially helpful was a very classical medium of a figurative painting, and we were joking that we are demonstrating in a radical demonstration on the street, and we are showing very classical art in the museum. But that paradox is showing exactly the dilemma we are facing. And the last one I want to mention is inventing the future, what always seems to be the role of the cultural institution, or at least those dealing with contemporary culture, versus current politics. We are all engaged, we are all part of current political events, so we are obviously involved into a very current acting situations, activism, supporting action, and so on and so on. But our intuition is that to invent the real future, we have to go beyond that we have to admit that even if the populist answer, it's completely wrong, is dealing with the real agenda, with the real fears, and obviously the real deficit of liberal democracy. And So it's extremely difficult to be in two positions in the same time, because we have to fight with the current situation, we have to simply survive, and then this main mission of the institution, inventing the future, is suffering, because we need a bigger perspective and a sort of bigger picture, which is extremely difficult to get when you are under the constant pressure. So those three dilemmas of institutional life are the most striking for us at the moment. Thank you very much, and I want to pass the table to Ute.
Sorry. No, I just wanted to. Oh, I also have an echo now. Can you hear me? Is it okay? Because I hear the echo.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. No, so I just have to say I didn't receive Manolo's reference because I just got Wi-Fi back today. But what you mentioned, also Germán and Joanna, does resonate also with the region where I'm currently working. I mean, since 7 years. Because I think the histories are very similar, although I would say the geocultural conditions are different. So, I mean, the region I'm in, Southeast Asia, in itself is already invented by the West as a geocultural region and comes strongly out of the Cold War period. So it's a little bit after colonial rule, which was, of course, a repressive rule, which was not exactly a moment of freedom of speech either. But I think it got renewed when, after a very short period of the non-aligned, of the independence movements here, like Bandung, and then, of course, in Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, Tito took over, but also in Algeria. And it was this moment of hope after colonial rule, I would say in Africa, Latin America, I mean, in Asia. And very quickly, the alliances were reconfirmed and reassured. And we have to say the West, with all its freedom of speech and with all its democratic rule, is no innocent player in all of this. And I think we have to look very closely into the attitude of like pointing the fingers on strong men that we face everywhere, and we should point those fingers. But there is, as Manolo said, there is a complicitness, there is a systemic and structural agreement for political interest and economical interest. And just to link to this, I mean, the US, particular in the Cold War period, had a very strong interest in our region, strategically, and later, I would say today, economically. So the complicitness after, for example, like Indochine collapsed, like the independence movement in Indonesia began, like, I mean, there was really an attempt to get away from the British and Dutch empires, particularly in this region. But soon other forces joined in, and I have to say, I mean, then came the occupation of Japan. But I think what the West learned from the Japanese rule is like culture plays an important role. So it's very interesting if you look in the Cold War period, also the role that, for example, the Museum of Modern Art played in cultivating the region for democracy, for openness, in a joint effort with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs with the State Department of the US, and more at the edges with the CIA. And it's very standard that in the 70s already you see major art and design exhibitions in Southeast Asia, in the Philippines, in many of the countries here, in Singapur, across, like in Malaysia, where America introduced democracy again, still, like, I think, fencing towards China and fencing towards communism in Vietnam, Cambodia. And so I think it's what we face today. I think this really confidence in repression as a tool of governing, I think, is a shared global one. And I think as cultural institutions, we are very vulnerable because, of course, it's already understood that culture is a powerful tool. Yeah, it is a thing very visible, and it is also it reaches in a different way the everyday of people. And I just made some notes when you were speaking, and we have to say we have to really be careful against the weaponizing of culture for political agendas, and also for capitalistic agendas. So it's both. And I think it's really important to look into what is not only described as an anthropocenic setting, where, of course, a lot of the climate crisis and violence against the environment has been caused by economic interest, also from the West, and what we call today the Capitalocene. And I have to say, I think after in the Philippines, Marcos was gone. Also, after Suharto has been ousted in Indonesia, and there was an opening in Cambodia, like towards more Western influences. Aung San Suu Kyi got the Nobel Peace Prize for her kind of like insisting of having a democracy in Myanmar. And at the moment, what we see is, I think, the same old, the very same than what you are confronted with in Eastern Europe, what we see in Latin America. It's the return of the strongman and the military regimes. And it's quite interesting that freedom of speech, but basically now joining alliances with Trump, shockingly. Then we see a very young democratization movement in Thailand against actually a country that was never colonized. It's an unbroken monarchy, the only one here in the region. This very young generation is on the streets right now. It's very interesting. And then, of course, we see Taiwan. Yeah, it's basically the only country in our region, I would say, where there's freedom of speech. But we know the political isolation of Taiwan. I mean, I think it's maybe now 18 countries who recognize Taiwan as a country for sheer political and economic. And what Joanna interest, if it comes to freedom of speech and censorship, self-censorship. It's like, if you have like an opposition against versus what you can go is one thing, but we all, of course, also in Singapore, we know exactly the fine line. How far can we go? I mean, before an election, it's a little less. After an election, it's that, and then slowly it eases. It's a bit like a muscle that gets tension and relaxes, gets tension again. So we kind of are playing the game. And to me, that's the worst, I have to say, because we have to deal with ourselves in this situation. And of course, I say myself also, I protect my staff. If we are gone, you would say anything. We are the last spaces. Manolo mentioned spaces of refuge. We actually are. But we are in the system. An institution is in the system. A university is in the system. We are not outside. We are not underground. We are not off spaces. We are not alternative spaces. But I think the more it's important we are there, because we still can create a protective shield for the others. And I think it needs this kind of global conversation to really address what can be done in such a situation. How can we support each other? And I mean, I see Simon, we all are part of the association of international museums of modern art that include, of course, museums of contemporary art and also non-collecting institutions like ours. And we have to really see what can we do structurally and systemically to address the structural and systemic violence that we experience through the repression of freedom of speech. And as Manolo said, I mean, we might not get arrested. I might just be, in worst case scenario, be kicked out of the country and lose my job. But I guess others face much stricter, I would say, charges. So what can we do as a global community in culture to really address this? And how can we really use also the powerful languages that we have, from poetry to street theater to visual art to film, through writing, and really join forces against an increasing repressive neo-fascism. I would leave it at that to have a discussion. Yeah, I think that was more or less it. I think it's really how can we find these languages? And I have to say, I was quite stunned to go back to my native country, to Germany, a country that has freedom of speech. It's in the middle of the West. It's economically sound. The discussion around Akile Mbembe and BTS, to see this and hear this from afar, has been quite stunning. And it did not sound very different to here. And that was a bit shocking to me.
Thank you, Germán. Thank you, Joanna. Thank you, Ute, for great interventions. I think you point, and also very specific interventions. Each one of you talk about different moments. So I think we have time just for one round, talking about censorships of format. That's probably we should have been needed to stay longer, but unfortunately, I think this is a discussion that is going to continue. So I would like to ask you, the three of you, one single question that somehow came out of what you say. You talk about self-censorship. You talk about, Joanna, about a bubble, museums being, in a way, a bubble. It was in all of you permanent idea of cultural wars. I mean, we are in a struggle, in a battle. Germán, you talk about the changes of through technology of public sphere, public space. So in all that context, somehow we know models of resilience, of resistance in history, in the 30s or whatever, but the situation, models that very often didn't succeed. But the situation has changed radically. So my question is, your own practices as professors, as curators, as directors, how you imagine or how you envision which type of spaces of resilience you could imagine for the future or for the present?
As I have the mic on, I just would say, I think education, giving historical samples, like we have a young generation that did not live through certain periods, not through Second World War, not through the Vietnam War, not through terrorism in certain countries, not through the Latin American dictatorships, not through what happened in Eastern Europe, not what happened in Africa. So I think education, introducing all of this as you say, I show the students here films, we introduce movements, we try to do that in our program, because as long as we say things about somewhere else, the censorship is more mild, I would say. But you can say the same about somewhere else, about your own place. So we have to find this kind of strength and show examples, what can be done. I always be very open to the students. I said I don't want to influence them. I don't want to put any ideology on them. I tell them, this happened here, this happened there, this has been done there, this has been done here, and let them discuss. It takes usually, particularly in Asia, where students are much more shy, a bit of time. We do the same with our audience, which I would say became our public over the past 7 years. And things are happening, not because of us, of course not, but we can be one of the platforms where you can discuss, both in the classroom, but also in the exhibition space.
Yeah, I totally agree. In the smaller scale, I would what we are doing is building coalitions in for very different in a very different agenda with the very different bodies, institutions, individuals. So that's giving us possibilities in the difficult situation, but also obviously this is creating an alternative structures, and these structures of trust, interest, support, care. And in the last few difficult years, what really was effective was the coalitions internally and internationally. I can also mention Internationale, the coalition of the Museum, which was extremely supportive and also inspiring. And in Poland, we, for instance, recently built the institutions which call themselves anti-fascist institutions. So just to save the notion of anti-fascist, which is obviously attacked by propaganda. So we created a coalition of 200 institutions, and so on and so on. So I would say coalitions, confederations, the relations of the independent, but the bodies which can even for a moment, accidentally, for short period of time, work on for the same interest.
Yeah. Well, several things. First, I believe that symbolic power is very important, and I totally follow Ute's comments on being inside the system, but not exactly working for the system, and also the idea of creating shields. Really, a very interesting example was 3 years ago when Trump started to change immigration rules and target specifically young people with no documents. Universities, or some universities in the States, decide just to go in front of political power and saying, okay, maybe it's not what the rule says, but we're not asking our students for papers, which is very interesting statement, saying we're beyond the law. I mean, we're sanctuaries, we're protecting our students, we're not asking for papers, which is something that you are supposed to do from a legal point of view. I cannot imagine any president of a university in Europe doing that. Of course, system is different, and consequence of the system is different, and public system, private. But it's a powerful sample, an inspiring sample of something that can be done, and something that Joanna mentioned is inspiration. This type of actions create replicas. So the inspirational actions serve, shows models and the way to other people. A second thing, very interesting, David Graeber, which was a fantastic intellectual that recently passed away, was someone very key for the articulation of Occupy Wall Street movement in New York, and created the most interesting recent study on the history of that. He wrote his last book, I think, was the utopia of rules. And it's something, it's a powerful reflection on how neoliberal institutions create more and more regulations. So we think on neoliberalism as a against regulation system, but actually increases bureaucracy, and the task of managing is occupying progressively more and more time for public servers, researchers, curators, and so on. So decolonizing time is also a key task for that, and redefining priorities. And it's a very complex task to do. How to deal with these new obligations in time regulation, task management, and so on. But also we need time for political organization, for political thinking, for political protest. And finally, my own practices, I think that transference is an important word, transfer of knowledge, of resources between university, institution, public society, individuals. So this rule of transferring and devolution is key. Second, imagination, so opening the imagination and using history and art and poetics as de-stabilization tools, the connection between memory and utopia, something that is key in my teaching and also in my research. And finally, the ethical sample. I think it's very, very important for students, for society as well, just to be very coherent with your own practices and to put together ethics and politics. In the particular contact with the students, it's fundamental to show that you care about them, and you care about what you're saying. It's not about blah blah blah. It's no, it's really at the core of your life. So just connecting our academic institutional activity with the citizen identity. I think it's key because also in the tradition of anti-fascism, personal positions and moral positions have been crucial, and also in the case of Kempler or many others, can tell. Okay, and thank you very much for the conversation and for the table.
Thank you
I
to
just I just want to add to that. I think if it comes to decolonization debates, also we have to be also very cautious because it's a very Western discourse again that is imposed on many other places. So again, the academic scholars and its academic excellence and infrastructure is kind of also neo-colonization of academic discourse. So I think is very important here in the region. People are very hesitant to these debates, and not that it's not necessary, and I think it needs this conversation, but they say, well, I mean, we don't have the luxury for such debates. We are facing climate change. We are facing new strongmen. We are facing multi corporations, many from the West, who going after the resources here, like deep sea mining is a new frontier. The mining in Papua New Guinea, the what happens all over the Pacific. Actually, Spain is one of the biggest poachers of fish. I always thought it's China. Actually, it's Spain. Interesting. So I think there is a lot to learn about geocultural dominance, and you mentioned the word hegemony. And I think our institutions could actually contribute to have a more open and a more just and globally balanced debate.
Thank you. We have, I think it's been a great debate. Thank you to the three of you. We'll continue. Now we have to give the word to the next table. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Nice seeing you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you soon, hopefully.
I hope we continue this. Very important.
We have no choice.